Season 3 of the Missing Witches podcast is lovingly sponsored by Foxglove Farm. Use offer code MISSINGWITCHES for a super witchy 13% off your next order. Welcome back to another episode of Witches Found. On this episode, Risa spoke to Elizabeth Swearingen.
Yeah, oh my gosh. Another academic, wise healer who's healed herself and has this incredible story to tell of leaving this like life that was built for her, this Mormon reality, this marriage, this whole world, and seeing herself and seeing this future for her daughters as a witch and truly claiming that to the point of, building this traveling tarot temple and, taking her fun, playful, powerful new life on the road. It was such a thrill to get to talk to this smart as fuck witch.
Mm-hmm. And she has done some amazing projects and has some amazing practices and praxis. So please take a listen.
You aren't being a proper woman, therefore you must be a witch. You must be a witch.
I'm so excited to be doing an episode of Witches Found and extra thrilled to be sitting down and Skyping with one of the first people who reached out with like joy and enthusiasm and just so much writing and shared thought when we launched the Missing Witches project. So today I get the pleasure of speaking with Elizabeth Swearingen. And we have so much I want to talk about, but I just want to tell you, I just love your writing and your work so much. And I'm so excited that you're on our little podcast.
Thank you very much. Just very happy to be here.
So we're talking today. There's so many things I want to talk about. I want to talk about faith and your sort of journey through religions and faiths and beliefs to where you are now. And I want to talk about being a witch in academia. But I want to start by talking about, maybe you could just tell us about what your weekend was like. I know that you were at a festival yesterday and you're doing readings in is it a Vardo?
Yes, it is. It's a type of gypsy wagon, and which my sweetheart and I built over the last year. It's been quite a process. A lot of magic involved in that as well. And yesterday was its maiden voyage, and literally we were still hammering nails in it an hour before we left.
Wow. Can you describe what the Vardo looks like, and maybe tell us a bit of the history of the term?
Well, I've always been fascinated with Romani culture and gypsy vardos and the idea of sort of the traveling magic show. And so growing up, I would have pictures on my wall but it was just something that I thought was just so unrealistic. I had looked at some of the prices of buying antique ones, and they're beautiful, but they're very expensive. Many of them are made in Europe. And so I just thought that, well, I'd have to be content with a painting on my wall. And then, along with a little bit of the Mormon story, my ex-husband just kind of showed up a year ago with this kind of box on a trailer and said, "Here's your start." And it was pretty rough. And but my sweetheart and I, we live in Idaho. He's got an enormous amount of building skills, and he just said, "Lizzie, can I take that to my shop for a while?" And he did, and completely redid it. It looks similar to a small home, but it's decorated inside kind of like an 1860s parlor, just large enough to have two people seated. It's very magical, very enchanting. And I wanted a container to do readings on site, whether I am working a group, an event, or I wanted what I call a liminal space, a space where people, when they walk in, that the mundane world leaves immediately just by the enchantment of the space alone. And then I wanted that intimacy. And the Vardo worked perfectly for that. And I'll talk a little bit later how I approach readings, but it was just a magical day. And it was a pagan fair. And so and there were other tarot readers there. So I wasn't really expecting much. This was just kind of to try things out, but the day went fine. And I read all day long with just enough break in between to grab a drink of water.
Yeah.
And it was a glorious experience. I had an enormous amount of fun.
You must, I imagine, feel both super drained and supercharged.
Well, the way I left is because all of these worlds intersect. The world of growing up in a Mormon faith, academia, magic, the occult, all of these things kind of come together. And I had the sense after I finished that it was very similar to the work that I've done as a women's studies professor in academia, as far as an embodied kind of pedagogy. And then having the ability to bring in a broad historical background. Because I see the work that I do with people as healing. I don't see myself as a traditional tarot reader. My doctorate is in educational anthropology, and that both matters and doesn't matter. It matters because for years I've studied languages and systems of communication coming from different cultures, from different forms. And tarot is a mythopoetic language that allows to have that sort of feminine consciousness or yin consciousness, the sense of deep, intuitive, subjective, embodied knowing. That type of knowing that our culture tries to kind of smash. And so in that space, I see tarot as that mythopoetic language that allows me to have access to other people's dream worlds and other people's higher self and souls. And so the experience that I have is as enriching for me as it is for them. And I never know the direction it's going to take. It goes in all kinds of different directions. But I find it very enriching on a two-way.
Yeah, I can imagine my limited experience delving in and playing with decks and starting to just listen to what came up for me and listen to what came up for them. It definitely feels like you're slipping under some rational knowledge. Would you talk more about how you started to work with tarot, or maybe how that transition happened for you from leaving the sort of Mormon world or Mormon structures of thought into having access to that mythopoesis?
Well, let me start out by saying that I'm writing a memoir, and the title of the memoir is A Witch in the Land of Mormon Oz. And because there's magic on both sides of that sort of fence. Initially, tarot was very much a transgressive act and a healing act as well. I was born within a Mormon faith and very devout. I married at age 17, kind of under as very, very common in Mormon culture, to an elder who just basically said on the second date, God has said I'm to marry you, and that was the end of the questions.
So this wasn't like casual Mormons. This was.
You're right, exactly. This is deep Mormon theology. There is always God in the bed between you. Right. And so it never even occurred to me that I would say no, even though I didn't even really know who I was marrying. And so it started a journey of raising children and living a Mormon lifestyle, when inside I was insatiably curious and pushing all of the boundaries I could. And it seemed like I was continually on a cycle of disobedience and then repentance and then more disobedience. But I loved the Mormonism is a very occult religion, even though my guess is Latter-day Saints would not see it, those who were inside, because it took getting outside for me to look back. So from a very young age, I was sort of taught a form of magical thinking that just developed naturally.
That's so interesting to hear you say that. My friend was telling me about some of the aspects of his faith, and he's Mormon, and I read more about is it Joseph Smith, and he had a stone that allowed him to read the early documents. So I was like, you and I have more in common than I realized.
Joseph Smith did scrying.
Scrying, yeah.
Right, scrying. It's not the faith-promoting story they tell within the culture. They change a few details because they wanted to sort of disavow its its early kind of occult beginnings in Masonry, and even some of the history coming from New England of deep spiritualism and the spiritualism movement.
Right.
But it's a deeply, deeply occult religion, especially the temple ceremony. And so I kind of developed a love of ritual and a love of the sense of feeling like there was a magical way to look at the world. When I left, and I left kind of in very much of a political move, I was, of course, told that I was going to go to hell and damnation, the whole thing that comes with shunning. And so I wasn't really sure exactly what was going to happen. I remember the first women's studies class that I taught after I finished my doctorate. I was sitting down getting ready to go to the class, and the Twin Towers were hit with planes.
Wow.
And I remember sitting in that chair thinking, what am I doing? And why, they're right. The world is coming to an end and I'm going to hell. And yet I had this inside curiosity that said, feminism is the most honest theory and practice I've ever experienced in my life. And so I thought, if it's hell that it is, then okay, I'm going to walk into it. Wow. And so my entrance into women's studies was very cataclysmic. It was the same time that Prop 8 was in California, very, very homophobic kind of legislation. And I stood up against that loudly and was kind of given a line. And so my response to that was, wow, this is a great time to do street theater and ritualize it. And so I not only went out, but I went out in an incredibly public way and, kind of hosted a witch burning between me, a few other women, and some Catholic gay priests that were also being excommunicated. Wow. And so my response has always been to be very, very, very public. But the magic that I found out was that all of the terrible things that I was told that would happen didn't happen. I was the same person. I had the same ability to tap into magic. I had the same love of the occult. I just didn't have all of the obedience and behavioralism that went with it. And so I don't really see myself as outside anti-Mormon trying to tear down, the great and abominable patriarchy. I see myself as someone who understands the intersectionality of our worlds, and that culturally, that is the place I come from. And there's so much of me that still holds that culture. I don't hold the belief system anymore or any of the practices, but I still feel a kinship. And I think I always will. Like, for example, most people are absolutely turned off by polygamy. I'm not at all. It was just such a natural, normal thing growing up that although I would never be in a polygamous relationship myself, I don't necessarily see that as outside the realm of possibility for other people. And so my journey out of Mormonism was one which was profoundly political. And assuming the name of witch was at first a political act, the sense of I'm going to claim this identity, because it seemed like the only identity that wasn't a cultural appropriation of some other identity. Because when you leave a culture that has been 100% of your life, then there is an identity crisis as well as a crashing of faith. That you're left in a vacuum. Of, who am I? What do I call myself? And do I want to actually take this term on? And what does it mean for me as far as my own evolution and my own spiritual journey? I certainly know what it means for people who are active LDS. It's an incredibly put off to them. But the last couple of years, I've just decided to fully own that identity in every imaginable way, both spiritually, culturally, and politically, and use that not only as a platform for my own personal work and writing, but for my academic. So I actually came out as a witch to my students this semester.
Tell me about that.
I thought that I would just get, tomatoes thrown at me.
Yeah.
But they were very excited and wanted to know where I would be, and they were interested in the blog that I had been writing, and I got a very positive experience, a very positive response from most of my academic colleagues as well, kind of like, well, we kind of already knew.
Right.
But I gave a speech at a local college as a professional witch. And I was sort of talking about, what is that container and what does that actually mean? Yeah. And what are the superstitions and how has it been signified by patriarchy and religion? And so when I first introduced myself, and this was a forum on multiculturalism, religious multiculturalism, and so I assumed that it would be fine. And a third of the audience got up and walked out.
Really?
And so that was a little shocking to me. And but those who remained, I think, fully embraced the idea. I had lots of people, especially young people afterwards, who kind of wanted to, tell me how to do it.
Yeah.
Kind of what I would call a Wicca 101.
Right.
But I am not affiliated with a coven.
Right.
I have an absolute aversion, because of my Mormon upbringing, to any kind of organizational or authority structure.
Yeah, I can see that.
Yes. And so I consider what I do to be open boundaries and very eclectic.
Yeah.
My practice evolved organically pretty much by myself.
Yeah. You've used the term word witch.
Yes. Yes.
Can you talk about that? When I read that really lit up for me, and part of how I think about where my own power comes from sometimes. And I also don't really identify with a coven or any idea of kind of, I don't really like rules or hierarchy in my practice. That's not what I'm looking for in a spiritual identity. And the only coven I kind of identify with is this loose and messy and improvised one that we have online with each other,
Yes.
But a word witch really, that really sings to me. Yeah.
Well, first of all, it's the power of language and the power of naming, the power of writing. And then again, as an educational anthropologist, I study those communication systems. I have found in the past that the power of the word, whether it's a visual image, because I consider that communication as well, or whether it is a written language, has the ability to not only promote change, but take you to another whole sphere of thinking. And so I love the idea of making our lives mythopoetic, that living the poetry, writing the poetry. And I think part of it has to do with my beginnings. When my faith crashed around me, it was the same time that a divorce happened. Because when you leave Mormonism, your whole family leaves you. Yeah. It's a total, absolute total. And I was kind of living in a completely empty house and had just finished my doctorate. My mother had just passed away from Alzheimer's. And I was in this space where it's like, I don't know who I am. I don't even know if I really exist. And I picked up, just by chance, a copy of Paul Coelho's The Witch of Portobello. I don't know if you've read that or not, but it's a piece of fiction, but it's a glorious story about a woman who finds her identity through energy. And I read that, and what I felt that was that I didn't know what I could trust in my life. And so I basically kept an empty home and made a kind of a covenant with myself that I wouldn't let anything back into my life unless it was truly authentic to who I was, that it really resonated with my energy. And so the first thing that I noticed was the moon. And I started to study the moon and its cycles, and then I started to have kind of circle ceremonies with myself alone, beating a drum, because the drum kind of told me, okay, you're still alive, you have a heartbeat, you can feel your heartbeat, and the moon is still in the sky and it's dependable. And so I wanted a level of what I call spiritual evolution that was coming from inside, coming literally from inside of me. I didn't want any influences from the outside. And so that involved a lot of writing and a lot of saying, you know, what do we mean literally when we talk about even kind of the kitsch term spelling, you know, in the sense that, you know, putting our intention out into the world through words, and then making those words more powerful through visual sigils or through ritual, so that you not only begin to write it in your mind, but it's written in your body. And that was really important for me, because our cellular memory carries so much, and you can mentally take yourself out of the space. But then, you know, Mormonism was in my DNA. And everything just felt that way. So my daughters and I, we decided to do something that was creative. And so we decided that since this Book of Mormon had fucked up our lives so much, that we would imagine, what if we were prophetesses, and what if we created our own religion through our writings? What would that sound like? So we took about 1.5 years, and we each journaled, and the only rule that we had was that we had to be fully present, in first person, and as honest as possible, just raw. And so we just wrote for the whole year, and then we would get together and read it, and then we realized at the end of 1.5 years we had written a work. We had written a work of art, which was very powerful. And so it was kind of, what do we do with this? Maybe this isn't just about our healing journey. Maybe this has a bigger purpose. So we decided to ritualize it in kind of a fun, magical way. We thought, let's go to the mountains, let's find a mound of a hill, and let's bury it. Because, you know, let's imagine, you know, if someone finds it 2,000 years from now, what kind of a religion or a belief system would it create? And it was just so deliciously wicked. Yeah. And it was so incredibly healing. And it was like taking a cellular memory and unwinding it and rewinding what was authentic. And that's where that sense of word witch and witch identity. So we did. We buried it up in the mountains and kept a copy for ourselves. But then some other people read it, and it's like, this is amazing. And so we produced a production called the Mormon Monologues, and where we performed it at colleges. And it was this very kind of similar to Vagina Monologues, this monologue of transition, of healing, and of awakening, and finding that sense of earth-based, more, what I would call eminence. You know, when you grow up in patriarchal religions, it's all about transcendence. It's all about overcoming the body and overcoming the world and overcoming everything. And then if you're in a religion that says if you're a woman, you really have to overcome a lot, then it's so body denying that I felt like, wait a minute, why do I want to live my whole life for a promise of continued marginalization in the hereafter? And so when I recognized that the Mormon heaven wasn't a place I wanted to be, it lost its power. And then I became fascinated with the idea of what does spiritual eminence look like, where it's messy and it's embodied and it's raw and it's without rules and boundaries. And it embraces all of what we experience as manifested human beings. I always kind of saw spirituality that was kind of grounded, like the idea of Mother Teresa, who is in a jail holding a prostitute's head while she throws up all over her. And I saw that as such a powerful image of the sense of being willing to literally be with the people on the ground, connected to the earth in a way that was fully present, fully eminent, and fully messy. And that's how my life has been, whether I've been arrested or whether I've done work in women's studies classrooms, in academia. I don't think I could use this term with other faculty, but I see myself as a shaman in the classroom. I see myself using shamanic pedagogy as a healer, especially when you're teaching critical consciousness or when you're teaching critical race theory and when you're doing the kind of work that sense of critical consciousness is, or, you know, liberation pedagogy. It's very much about healing people's worldviews, giving them a place to find their own voice. And so I think from the people outside looking in, they will compartmentalize it. They'll say, well, there's this part of you, and then there's this part of you. But for me, just like many people who have an intersexual identity, it isn't compartmentalized. Mm-hmm. It flows from one situation to another situation, although I might have to use different terms. Mm. So the blog is an attempt for me to put short pieces out that have magic woven in them, that have the power of change and transformation, metamorphosis through the word. And to me, that's magic. And to me, that is totally what a word witch is.
Yeah, I love that. Do you have, for our listeners, we have maybe a lot of young, like me, although I'm not that young, witches who struggle, I do, to allow the pieces to kind of meld into each other, to allow myself to live in all the worlds together, like you're describing, to let the identities be one. I think it's so brave to come out as a witch in academia. Also, I want to hear the story about when you got arrested and more about the witch burning. And I don't know how to work that into this question, but just talk more about all of these things.
It is very difficult to go between an objective and a subjective world, or to have one foot in each place. I know I start out my classes at the beginning of the year with MC Escher's artwork, and I ask the students to pay attention what their eye wants to do and what they're feeling. And the students try and change the picture to fit they want to find a focal point. And MC Escher is an incredible artist who is both an architect and a designer and an artist and an illusionist. And so it prevents the students from finding that spot, and they get weirded out by that. And so very few students enjoy that process of ambiguity, or that spaces of in between. And so I try and move them to a place, the sense of that we live in a constructed world of dualism, but reality is really non-dual. We really live in a world which is both and, even though we are continually forced by capitalism and by, Western civilization to do an either or, win, lose, good, bad, and those default judgments just happen continually. And so I try and introduce them in the sense that there are multiple ways of being in the world which are coexistent and equally valid. And that we're not trying to find the winner or the best one, we're trying to find the bridges between them. Or kind of like a quilt with mosaics. Each mosaic brings its sense of identity, but once you bring them together in a quilt, the whole quilt can warm you. And so students struggle mightily with that. I struggle mightily with the idea of moving from between those two spheres. So, because when you're doing tarot reading or I'm writing as a witch, I go into a zone which is very subjective and very liminal, and where time and space suspends itself. And there is just sort of like a flow of information that I'm just capturing. And then you have to put that aside and then go do the dishes, or get in a car and drive. And so I've had to incorporate in my personal practice ways in which I can ground continually ground. Okay, you've been in this space and this flow now for 4 hours. You're going to be too dizzy and too hypnotic to drive. So you're going to have to wait a few minutes, walk by the river, have something to eat, and kind of bring yourself back into that, mundane reality, and then you're safe to get behind the wheel of a car. Part of my exit, my early years in Mormonism and struggling to try and be a mother and a wife with 4 children, was trying to live within a worldview that I told that if I just obeyed, things would work, but it didn't work for me. And so I kept thinking if I could just understand it better, I could make it work. And so I would have moments of clarity and then I'd lose it again. And eventually I came to a place in my 30s when I just said, fuck this. This is absolute brain fucking, and I'm not going to do it one more day. I'd rather die, strike me to hell. And I decided to see a therapist. And the therapist took me through 2.5 years of extensive kind of primal hypnotic regressive therapy, which was wonderful, by the way, absolutely incredibly healing. But what it did for me is it made that subjective state of sort of suspension my natural state. It's the place that I normally go to. And so I guess what I'm saying is I struggle with the very question that you put to me. How do you, because it isn't about fitting in. I finally recognized there isn't any place that I am going to fit in. I'm the bridge. Yeah. I'm the bridge person. And I'm going to have to accept the fact that other people have the power of naming, even if I re-signify that. They still have the power of judgment and naming. They may have position power, they may have organizational power. And so there are times when you have to just sort of dare to be silent. There are times when it's probably not safe. But then there are other times when I think that you can sort of push the envelope and you can be more completely public and allow people to evolve. Now, as far as my actual ritual practices, initially I bought spell books and stuff like that, and wondered whether or not I had the right candle and the right color and was I doing it right, and then I saw the deeper pattern underneath it. I saw, this is really about finding a way we can embody our intention and embody the sense of connecting. It's a bridge. The props are a bridge. They're an important one because they hold meaning. And but that's all. The magic is always within us. The props are the way we embody it and sort of move it into a cellular memory. And the more we repeat it, the more beautiful it becomes, and the more embedded it becomes, and the more mythopoetic it becomes. And because it doesn't really matter what religion you're taking a look at, if they have a belief system and they have a way of ritualizing that ritual creates culture and creates tradition and creates identity. And so I'm not even remotely against ritual. I just think our rituals should be very conscious and understood. What are we doing? Writing these messages on our bodies, our cellular memory is important stuff, but we better really know what we're doing, because I would argue it's much harder to deprogram that cellular memory than it is to change your mind or to learn something critically, to think critically. Does that answer it somewhat?
Yeah. I mean, it opens so many more questions, but in such a good way. I admire so much the bravery of that moment that was obviously many years coming, of saying, no, not one more fucking day of this. Like, I'm going to make my own rituals, because I do know a little bit about how much you lost maybe when you did that, or I can guess from other people I know, like how much community, how much support, and how much like whole world view. And so it's so incredible that you were able to build that again with your daughters in a text that lives on a mountain somewhere.
Right, exactly. I compare it to Judaic Judaism, conservative fundamentalist Judaism, which is a 100% lifestyle, separated, isolated. Yeah. Mormonism has a little bit more public view, but internal to it is very much about you're outside of the world, you're not connected to the people around you. You can put that face forward, always be a wonderful ambassador. Make sure that whatever you do reflects on the goodness, of the faith. And so it's more of an ideological boundary, but it's still profoundly isolated, just profoundly so. And so when you leave and you have like a shattered faith crisis, you lose everything. You lose family, you lose a marriage, you lose friends. You have an army of people who now see you as evil and apostate, and then they want to prove to themselves how bad you are, and so it can get vicious. And in my sort of moving into women's studies, it got incredibly vicious. with mean-spirited acts. Like the first time we ever performed the Mormon monologues, a group of LDS students decided to shut it down, and so they pulled a fire alarm. Or there would be mean-spirited letters sent. There was just a lot of, or a bishop would come and say, you really need to fire her, and to my dean, things like that. And so there was this 10,000 people that I always envisioned as an army around me, trying to destroy this very, very, very public person. And my response to that has always been the sense of, your silence doesn't save you. And my safety was in my public performance of ritual. And I had some position power because I was a professor and I did have a doctorate. And so it was harder for them to just dismiss me. And I just had this happen at the university that I teach at. I got a letter saying, we want to push against this structure of oppression, but you're not tenured, so maybe we really shouldn't have you on the list. And sort of like, we'll protect you by striking your voice away. And my response to that was, no way. That sometimes when you're in the margins, you have a stronger voice, and that I'm not going to be silenced. And I never have, and I never will be. And yeah, that might mean some consequences, but nothing could be as scary to me as losing my family and losing a job. I mean, you just lose everything. Yeah. And so there isn't anything as scary after you kind of face that kind of existential crisis. And I actually feel like I am a much more spiritual person now, with a much more expanded worldview and a hell of a lot less judgment. I look back on the person I was and all the judgments I had to make in order to stay in the center. And I'm appalled. I'm appalled at sort of some of my own behavior 20, 25 years ago. And so it's a delicate line to kind of, just because I live in an LDS culture in Idaho, to allow people to have their freedom of belief and to not carry grudges. I mean, really, not to fall into just being the anti part of it to where you're out to tear it down. But in a way that still allows me to be who I am. And so interestingly enough, in academia, especially within California, I was known as the Mormon Women's Studies professor, which is somewhat of an oxymoron. But I would have LDS students would flock to my classes. And so the other professors would maybe have 1%, Mormon student occasionally. I'd have 30, 40%. Wow. And I would get three types of students. I would get the Mormons who were, the acronym that is used is TBM, Totally Believing Mormon, who were there to prove me wrong, to prove that I was a bad person. And so they were in my class to, quote, bring the bitch down. And then there were a lot of gay Mormons, a lot of LGBTQ Mormons who were just trying to survive. They were just trying to live. And then there were these questioning ones that they wanted to have a straight answer for someone who knew both what it was like to be inside the culture and outside the culture. And so there was this alchemy going on all the time of these students who would want to speak to me. And I would continually have to say, I have to take my professor hat off if we're going to have this conversation. And that negotiation doesn't happen too much here in Idaho. I'm not as well known. I left Mormonism in California, and so I don't really have that kind of. I'm much more known as a witch than a Mormon here. And so if people are put off by me, it's probably put off more by the sense of witch. My house screams it.
Yeah. It's hard not to over time, eh?
Yeah. I mean, it's loud because it's loud and proud everywhere around.
I wondered if you would maybe as a closing question or thought or even meditation for our listeners, share, we could call it a spell or a word witch working or an academic exercise or homework, something that we can go away and work on in this sort of philosophy of building our own mythopoesis, of building our own maybe freedom from patriarchal structures. Do you have a thought about something like that? I know I'm putting you on the spot, but...
Yeah, well, let me share something that I did the other day, and just put it out there for the people who like to work with symbolic languages. I was kind of working on this idea of how do we develop those psychic skills, and what do they look like, and are they really just these special talents that just certain people have, or is it something which is just part of that subjective, more intuitive knowledge that we listen to it more, and so it develops more. So I was reading it, and then I thought, oh golly, I'm so tired. I think I'm just going to go take a nap. And the moment I laid down, this incredible impression came to me. You need to get up and you need to go out into your Vardo parlor that you've created, and you need to do an ancestral reading. You actually need to do this. And at the time I thought, oh, that, boy, that's really pushing the envelope. I'm not going to do it. But it wouldn't go away. And so I did. And it was profound. So let me put this out there as just something that people can try. And you can try it with automatic writing. You can try it with tarot. You can try it with journaling. You can try it with art. Is take a moment to imagine someone who's passed on in your life that was dear to you or important to you. Get their image in your mind. Say their name silently. Allow their full presence to come into your visualization. Feel their emotion. Make it as tactile as you can. Remember the smell. Maybe add a little bit of music that they loved. And when you feel yourself sort of merging into the sense that their presence is there, then allow them to speak to you through any kind of symbolism you choose. You create a container, but the voice is coming literally from beyond the veil, through you, through your intuitive, subjective knowing, and then capture it. You can capture it in tarot cards, so you can basically sit down and say, I did it with my mother. Mother, you're here, you're present. I saw her smile. I could smell her winsome perfume. She loved Madame Butterfly. I brought in Madame Butterfly. I waited until it was her. I could hear singing Madame Butterfly. And then I said, okay, it was her hand shuffling the cards. Now tell me, what a message do you have for me? And it was an absolutely rivetingly powerful experience of giving this, whether that ancestral knowledge was coming from inside of me. I didn't worry about where it was coming from because I lived with my mother. So of course her essence is in me. So it didn't require a strong belief system in a hereafter. It just required the sense of knowing that within us we are repositories of generational understanding. And I am fascinated with that sense of generational knowledge. And then allow that message to come forth, whether it is writing a letter to yourself, whether it is journaling your thoughts and feelings, or whether it is allowing maybe 4 tarot cards to capture that message. And so what I did was I captured that message. I stayed with it. I pondered it for a moment. I actually created sacred space, beforehand. And then I stayed in it maybe about 20 minutes. Until I felt this sense of completion and closure, and then I closed the circle and sort of let it go. And I'm so glad what I did was I followed the messages that came inside of me. That I don't know whether you would call them intuition or soul messages or psychic messages that said, I want you to do this because this is very real. And so it's one of the things of the toolkit that I've added to my readings, because I recognize that it was a wonderful opportunity to tap into generational knowledge, and that the tarot as a dream language can do that beautifully. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a situation where you're sitting with somebody and it's like, you have to prove to me that you are actually channeling or speaking to someone in my family, that you can bring their essence into into that space. I mean, we call in our ancestors all the time when we have sacred circle. Mm. And so I would to put it out there to try it, to allow yourself to go beyond the boundaries of what you think being a witch is, or what you think that you can actually do. Because what do you have to lose? You really don't have anything to lose and everything to gain. And so I tried it yesterday in reading a few times. It was a little bit scary, this idea of calling in someone's ancestor or generational knowledge, but it worked beautifully. Mm. And I think the parting word that I would leave is trust that once you have that seed of spirituality, which is growing, kind of like the Empress card, it's a life force that you have to nurture and protect and keep alive, but eventually it will evolve into a life of its own, and it will be authentic, and it will just be something that enriches the world and enriches your life. And so I would say, just trust, lean into it, hold space and trust.
Thank you so much.
You must be a witch.
Season 3 of the Missing Witches podcast is lovingly sponsored by Foxglove Farm. Use offer code MISSINGWITCHES for a super witchy 13% off your next order.